All right, so we've talked about our measures of center, mean, median, mode. We've talked about measures of variability, or measures of spread, like range and IQR. And we've talked about how to calculate an outlier. Okay, there's another term that I want you to know, and that's percentile. When you are a young child, you have well-child checkups. Okay, so your parents would have taken you to the doctor, they would have measured your height and weight, and they would have told your parents, you are in the 95th percentile for height. Okay? What that means is 95% of children in your age are your height or less. So there's only 5% of kids your age that are taller than you. Okay? That's what it means to be in the 95th percentile. A percentile is a number from 0 to 100 that we can associate with a value x from our data set. It shows the percent of data that are less than or equal to x. For example, if x is at the 63rd percentile, then 63% of the data are less than or equal to x. So in our data here, we have midterm test scores for a Spanish class. The question is, what value is at the 65th percentile? In other words, which of my numbers would represent the value where 65% of the kids scored that or lower? Okay, so the first thing you want to do is double check. Are your numbers in order? Just like we put them in order for calculating the median, we need to put them in order to find the percentiles. So are my numbers in the chart going in order? Okay. Then we have to figure out how many numbers are there. In other words, how many students took this test? There's 20 scores. Okay, so we have 20 students. What we're going to do is find the 65th percentile for that, okay? So we're going to take 65% of that 20. 65% could be written as 0.65. What is 65% of 20? So that tells me, of those 20 scores, the 13th number in my list will represent my 65th percentile score, okay? So I need to find the 13th number. Okay, so going through, we had 7 numbers in each row. So the 13th would be this 82. So I would say 82 is at the 65th percentile. Okay, that means 65% of those students scored an 82 or lower. Does that make sense? Okay, so if we were going to calculate the 55th percentile, how would we start it? We'd have to find 55% of the 20 scores. What is 55% of 20? 11. Okay, so now we have to go in our list, right, and count and find the 11th number. Okay. So if 82 was the 13th, then the 79 would be the 11th percentile. All right. I'm going to pause the recording. You guys find the last one there. Find the 95th percentile. All right. So 95% of 20 ended up being 19. So what was the 19th score? 98. So 98 would be the score where 95% of the students scored that or lower. Okay? Questions about percentile? All right. We are going to look at some statistics on our graphing calculator, what it can help us find. Before we start, when we calculated box and whisker plots by hand yesterday, what were the 5 numbers we had to find? We called it the 5-number summary. What 5 values did we look for? Min and max, and then what? Q1, Q2, and Q3, right? What would it mean if my box and whisker plot looked like this? probably an outlier up in the top, right? Because based on this picture, all of my data, 75% of my data anyway, the stuff down here, right, is very condensed. Okay? Remember that each chunk represents 25% of my data. So if I had 12 scores, there's 3 in each of those chunks. Does that make sense? But this is showing me that the lower 75% of my data is very close together. The other 25%, that top 25%, is really spread out, and it's probably the result of an outlier out here, that if we took that out, maybe my data only goes out to here. Does that make sense? But that outlier is going to drag that whisker out. So we do want to make sure that we have our number line very nicely spaced, evenly spaced tick marks, so that we can really tell how big these different intervals are. Okay? We are going to let our calculator help us do that today. So that's why I had you enter the data in your lists for St. Petersburg and Key West, the data we had yesterday. It's asking us to use a graphing calculator to compare or to look at the data for St. Petersburg. All right. The second question that we're going to do on this deals with the Key West. So that's why I had you put them both in at once. All right. So step 1 is to go into that stat edit screen and enter your data. We put St. Petersburg in list 1, right? And we put Key West in list 2. Okay. Now we're going to go to our stat plot. Stat plot is your second y equals p. So see your y equals p in the top corner. Do second y equals. We want to select plot 1. Make sure that it is turned on. And then we need to select this picture. All right, it should look like a box and whisker plot with a line through the middle. Okay. And then we are going to start out saying we want list 1 for our x's. Remember that box and whisker plots are a single dimension. All right, we're plotting this just on a regular number line. We don't have an x and y axis. Okay, we're just graphing the x's. Our next step is to go to our window key, and we are going to set our minimum to 50 and our maximum to 90. We talked about that yesterday, that we looked at the low and high values for the temperatures, and if we go a little bit on the outside of that, we'll make sure we see everything. Our x scale here is set to be 5. That means every 5 we'll see a tick mark. Okay. And notice the y values here. We are going only from 0 to 1. We don't need a whole big space in the y direction because we're only graphing x's. All right? So it just cleans it up for us nicely to just put that down as 0 to 1. Okay? Then you're going to hit your graph key, and you should see a picture like this. Okay? You won't see numbers on yours right now, but if you go to trace, just hit the trace key and use your left and right arrows. You should be able to bounce on your graph between the different quartiles and the min and max. And you should be able to see the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Can you do that? You seeing it? All right, let's check. So the picture that you have on your screen right now is for St. Petersburg data. We're going to compare that with Key West. All right? So what I want you to do is go back to your stat plot. Okay, second y equals. This time choose plot 2. Set it to be a box and whisker plot again. But this time now, instead of list 1, we're going to use list 2. To get that, you just do the second key and the number 2 key. And now when you hit graph, you shouldn't have to reset your window. Now when you hit graph, you should see 2 of them. Yes? Questions on that? All right. The last thing we're going to look at is what other statistics can our calculator help us find? There's a typo here. This should say calc, not edit. So we're going to go back to our stat key, but we're going to choose Calc and then select one variable stats. All right, so stat, calc, one variable stats. The very first thing you should see is X bar. Yes? I'm assuming it defaulted to list 1. You can change that if you need to do variable stats on list 2. You can tell it to use list 2. Okay? But for list 1, you should have an X bar. What did that mean? That was mean. Okay. Then you see some symbols like this, summation of x squared, right? Some of those things. Okay, ignore those. We're going to talk about those things tomorrow. Go down, you should see an n equals. In this case, it should be n equals 12. That's telling me how many numbers I have in my list. Okay, and then keep scrolling down. What else do you see? Should say minimum, yes. Q1, Q2, which is median. Q3 and max. There's your 5-number summary, right? That's what you would need to make a box and whisker plot. What are some of the statistics we talked about that you don't have your calculator find for you? Okay, so it didn't show me outliers. What else? It didn't give me mode. Could I do that by hand? Okay. It didn't give me range, but it did tell me min and max, right? Could I subtract those two numbers to find my range? Could I subtract Q1 from Q3 and find my interquartile range? So we really can get a lot of the statistics we did by hand yesterday with our calculator. Okay, so I'm going to have you work on that. You are doing day 2 today. It is on page 708. And I will be getting that worksheet passed out to you that you need as well. I would start with the couple questions from your book. Okay.